Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. All right there, Dustin. Welcome to the World Vape Show 2022 conferences. We have 3 packed days for you, but we're going to kick off today's session with a look at the global vaping perspective. So we're going to get to grips with what's happening in the vaping industry around the world, and we're going to explore what opportunities and challenges other countries are facing, and how we can learn from those experiences, especially here in the UAE. So I'm John Dunn, Director General of the UK Vaping Industry Association, and I'll be your moderator for the next 3 days. Joining me via video today is Mr. Ao Wenyu, who is Secretary General of the ECCC. And panelists today with me here on stage is Fred Roeder, Managing Director of Consumer Choice Center, Dustin Dahlman, President and co-founder of the Independent European Vape Alliance, and joining us virtually is Peter Beckett, co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Vaping.com, and Patricia Kovacic, founder of Regulation Strategy, and she's joining us virtually from the GFN in Warsaw today. So we're going to kick it off, first of all, with a video from Mr. Ao from China, and then Dustin will give his presentation. Thank you.
理事们、先生们，迪拜国际电子烟展的嘉宾们，大家好，我是中国电子商会电子烟专业委员会 ECCC 秘书长敖伟诺。非常感谢主办方的邀请，让我在迪拜国际电子烟论坛分享中国的电子烟产业的现状与发展的情况。ECCC 是中国电子商会下属的分支机构，在中国电子商会的领导和管理指导下独立开展工作。ECCC 从2017年1月份在深圳成立以来，以引导行业规范发展为重点的工作，严格执行中国有关电子烟行业发展的方针政策，架起海外沟通的桥梁，也与企业架起了这个沟通的桥梁。那么在去年的12月17日，由 ECCC 主办的2021第5届国际电子烟产业高峰论坛，围绕着电子烟新政策、品牌出海、资本风口等话题与电子烟企业进行了交流，吸引了超过1000人现场参会，线上观看的人数也超过了40万人次，也邀请了海外的各个电子烟协会的嘉宾们也在进行线上的分享。那么现场也有近20家的金融投资机构来到会议的现场。2021年，中国电子烟制造及品牌的企业超过了1500家，电子烟供应链及周边的服务企业也近10万家。中国电子烟零售网点达到19万家，电子烟产品的技术不断的创新，安全与质量的提升，消费者的粘性不断的增强。很多的企业也在这个打造 GMP 车间，打造 CNAS 实验室，在产品研发、在质量安全方面呢，正是我们的企业也面临了一场变革。那么更多的企业在重视合规、重视质量安全方面呢，是进行了这个优化。那么下面我们也简单介绍一下出口的情况。在出口方面呢，2021年中国电子烟产业的出口额也达到了1383亿人民币，同比增长了是180%，其中以一次性电子烟为主，那么占比达到65%，开放式的电子烟呢占比17%，换弹式电子烟呢占8%，出口国以美国、欧盟、俄罗斯、英国为主，那么占据的出口额呢达到84%。在专利方面呢，近3年来，中国的电子烟企业这个集中涌现，申请了很多的专利。那么在过去的1年，
2021年专利申请达到4965个，其中以民营企业成为申请专利的主力，占比达到89.6%。那么电子烟的技术将迎来快速发展的时期。在中国，电子烟从发明诞生到现在已经经过20年的发展了，一直也处于这个监管空白的状态。在今年，电子烟管理办法发布了，明确了监管的主体和产品的属性。电子烟呢，作为新型烟草来定性，那么中国的电子烟产业将迎来法治化的监管。ECCC 作为政府与企业沟通的桥梁，那么在法规制定、政策落地、企业合规化、行业可持续发展方面也起到了重大的作用。电子烟委员会呢，也提供了很多的建议，被监管机构采纳了。那么在出口方面呢，这个电子烟企业会迎来非常快速的发展期。电子烟的管理办法呢，那么规定了从原材料的采购、雾化物的添加、市场的产品的准入，到我们整个的流通、批发、零售都进行了严格的规范和这个约定。目前的电子烟管理办法尚未正式实施，也为我们整个行业设置了过渡期。那么过渡期的时间是在今年的9月30号截止，到了10月1号就正式实施。那么在这个过渡期期间呢，我们 ECCC 也会积极的配合这个企业做好各种合规，做好各种服务，也为监管机构与企业之间架起沟通的桥梁。经过中国市场监管洗礼的电子烟企业呢，将在原材料采购、技术发展、科研方面呢，会进行的优化。那么对于未来的发展格局呢，有相对来说对我们整个行业的长期发展呢，就起了非常好的一个作用。未来方面呢，在技术研发、消费者洞察、营销模式等方面打下了更深厚的根基。中国的电子烟产品呢，在符合企业合规化发展等方面呢，会给全球用户带来更好的体验。有了监管，有了这个质量方面的标准，那么这个对于全球消费者来说，会给大家带来更好的这个质量安全的保障，从而实现在全球市场的竞争优势。中国的电子烟，在未来呢也会蓬勃发展，不会受到影响。那么在当前百年不遇的大机遇之下，我们呢也将与全球各国的电子烟协会保持友好的、密切的合作，加强国内各大电子烟企业之间多个领域的互信与合作，全维度的为电子烟产业服务。那么我们的 ECCC 也在打造国际化的一个协会，我们组建国际团队，扩大办公室，成立这个合规国际发展部，从宣传，从这个与世界各国电子烟协会的对话、贸易等等，我们会进行了一系列的升级，以来积极应对规范发展的新时期。那么我们整个电子烟从全球发展的趋势来看，已经进入新的时代了。全球的电子烟产业的必然朝法治化、规范化、国际化的新格局发展。唯有不断的创新，才能潜藏先机。那么唯有把质量安全做好保障，唯有把我们的新材料、新技术这个 更好的应用在电子烟的产品上。唯有把我们的这个未成年保护等等的问题把它做好，我们这个行业会迎来更加健康有序的发展。
最后，预祝迪拜国际电子烟展圆满成功，也期待与各位同仁们能够有更友好的对话和贸易和这个来往。期待疫情早日结束，也期待与你们共同推动电子烟行业的繁荣发展。谢谢大家。
I'm happy to be here. My name is to be here again. Thanks for the invitation to the Vape Show, and thanks John for inviting me. Yes, my name is Dustin Dahlmann. I'm the chairman of the Independent European Vape Alliance. We are the only international and European vaping industry association that fights for vaping best interests on a national and on European level. Our association is chaired by 3 industry experts from Italia, Romania, and from Germany. Besides my job as a chairman in the Independent European Vape Alliance, I'm also the chairman of the German e-cig Association, and I'm the CFO of InnoSix, which is a German wholesale business. Our association is a strong union of 18 countries and 25 businesses, and it is important to mention that we do not allow tobacco companies between our members. What does IEVA? We are balancing the debate to the better for the e-cigarette and are in exchange with high-ranking politicians, jurisdictional experts, and also educate and inform in a great bandwidth in online, in media in general, and of course in public debates. Our perspective is driven by the need for a better vaping regulation. Next to the communication, of course, our focus is on public affairs. We advocate, as I said, nationally and on the European level for better vaping regulations. And you can see here 3 to 4 frameworks that are right now very important for our industry. It's the TPD2, it's the revision on the Tobacco Excise Directive, it's the new battery directive, and it's the single-use plastic directive. And I will give you in this pretty short presentation just a short overview and maybe ideas for questions to our panelists. Most pressing right now is the revision of the Tobacco Excise Directive. The current text framework does not include e-liquids or e-cigarettes in any way. The review is ongoing, and the position by the Commission is expected by the end of the year, probably October earliest. Nationally, we see tax rates in Europe between 0 and 40 cents. The average is 15 cents. On the slide, you can see the weighted average with 30 cents. And right now, 15 out of 25 countries are taxing e-liquids, and Germany will be the 16th with the beginning of July. A second very important topic for our industry in Europe is the revision of the TPD2. So far, the TPD is regulating things like the notification. You have to notify your products when you want to sell them on the market. You have a 6-month standstill period. The TPD is regulating the 20 milligram per milliliter nicotine cap, and for example, the bottle size for nicotine-containing liquids, which is currently 10 ml. The revision is ongoing and will take to 2025, 2026. The first draft by the Commission is to be expected by 2024. What we see on a national level, and here we are afraid that we see a spillover effect, is flavor bans on national levels. For example, last country that introduced a flavor ban is Denmark. The next that is planning is the Netherlands. We see regulations on plain packaging, advertising bans, and this is important for us because we have to avoid that these rules will apply on a European level. But I can also tell that we see some positive signals on a European level. The European Parliament dealt with the BECA, with the European Beating Cancer Plan, and in that plan, the Parliament gave a strong positive signal to this industry and also to the Commission. They wrote down in the final paper of the BECA that the e-cigarette is overall accepted as a less harmful alternative to combustible cigarettes. The harm of the product should be compared always with traditional cigarettes, which is what we are asking for all the time, but the Commission is still ignoring that since many years. And they accepted that the e-cigarette can help smokers to quit smoking. Another important point for our industry, not just for our industry, but it will affect our industry, is the new battery regulation, new battery directive, which is also in revision right now, and we think the implementation we will see that in the end of this year or in the beginning of next year. For now, it's under vivid debate between the European Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. The new battery directive focuses on batteries in laptops, cell phones, and cars, but e-cigs will be covered because our products work and are functioning in the same way like the products I mentioned. The revision is, as I said, is planned for the end of this year, and for our industry, this will mean that some things we see so far, that batteries will not be allowed to be glued to the casing anymore. They should be disposed probably in separation. The battery should be removable, which leads to the first point. It can't be glued to the casing. And if the device outlives the battery, it has to be replaceable. It's overall, or to put it in one sentence, it's a clear indication eco-friendly will become a more important topic in the future. Another important point is the single-use plastic directive. Of course, the overall goal is to reduce plastic waste in Europe. There are a series of measures planned: product bans, design requirements, targets for separate collection, awareness raising measurements, and extended producer responsibilities. These currently focusing on tobacco cigarettes. The revision is scheduled for 2027. In conclusion, e-cigarettes are still, compared to other markets, a small market, but we will be covered by these regulations, and this means that it will change a lot how our products are produced, how they work, and especially how they can be disposed. Non-sustainable devices will be a general subject on these regulations, single-use plastic and the new battery directive. I don't think that this has any effect on the bottles, to be honest, because we have here the 10 milliliter cap, which is a part of the TPD, and I think they will not change it. But especially for disposable e-cigarettes, which are a big hype right now, this can mean a big change. So, maybe the most important topic for you here is what are the current trends in Europe at the moment? It's simply to say, easy to use devices that are small, have a good battery, a good taste, which is more and more important for the consumer. They focus on that. So we think open systems, pod systems that are refillable, or that's what we see in the numbers from the member states all over Europe, from our members, are currently extremely increasing. We see difficulties for the disposables because they're, as I said, they are a strong trend right now, and it's a pretty good business. But when we talk just about regulations, we do not see them keeping up with legal environment which focus on sustainability. So these products has at least at one point to change or adopt to the new regulations. Some numbers, Here you can see the expectations we have for this year in the biggest markets in Europe without UK, Germany, France and Italy. The gray ones are the numbers, are the market numbers, and the green ones are the numbers of vapers. We had a good feeling for this year, but what we see so far and what our members tell us is that the market is really rocketing in the first month of this year. In every member state, Italy, France, Germany, but also Romania and other parts of Europe, we see in the last 2 months a really, really big increase of the turnovers. We see that this has to do with the end of the corona restrictions and, of course, with the popularity of the disposable e-cigarettes. So for the upcoming year, it's the same. Our expectation were already good, but we think we will have a probably huge, bigger growth than we expected. So in conclusion, we have a very good situation in Europe right now. The market is recovering and is increasing from month to month. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Dustin, for taking us through Europe, and thanks to Mr. Au for taking us through the current situation in China. As I said earlier on, my name is John Dunn. I'm Director General of the UK Vaping Industry Association. For those of you that know, the UK is quite a favourable market for vaping products, and we're doing our best to keep it that way. The UK VIA is the largest trade association for the sector in the United Kingdom, and we've seen our membership grow surprisingly throughout the pandemic, and we've almost grown by 75% in the last 12 months. We were founded in 2016 with the view to represent the whole breadth of the industry. We're a fully inclusive organization, so we do have tobacco company members as well. And we really have provided that interface between the industry, government, regulators, and the healthcare departments. Oops, sorry, I'm going a little bit too far there. Taking a look at the UK market for 2022. The UK market is the second largest market in the world and growing. We have no extra taxes applied to vaping products, and in fact, there's actually a push at the moment in the UK to bring the VAT rate down to 5%, to bring it in line with other nicotine replacement therapy products. Now, officially, we're not allowed to call vaping products nicotine replacement therapies, but the government does, so we're quite happy to take their lead on that. Vape shops have seen a rebound from first the Avali situation and then obviously the lockdown situations in the pandemic. But we're starting to see new stores open up, and in fact most of the large chains now have started to open new stores throughout the country. We've seen a huge explosion, as Dustin mentioned, in disposable brands, when we're seeing about 6,500 disposables registered in the first year of them being available, which is phenomenal. But that's also putting pressure on pricing and margins for many of these brands. And the latest e-cigarette intelligence numbers sees the average sale price for a disposable device gone down from $5.79 to $4.95. But we're also seeing different now routes to market. We're seeing a lot of these home delivery services popping up. And what we're finding is there's a huge late night, evening purchasing mechanisms that are coming to the forefront. But we're seeing a lot of problems with those, especially around age verification and young people getting a hold of the products. But we take a quick look at the market and how that's developing. I know Dustin talked about a 40% increase predicted in Europe this year. We're also seeing similar trends. From a dip in 2020, we saw growth in 2021 of around about 20%. And 2022 currently is running at about 11% on top of that. So a very, very robust market, which is great to see. Our vaping population is sitting roughly about 3.5 million at the moment, and that represents 7% of the over 18 smoking population. So if we take a look at the makeup, this is kind of where you'll see a little bit of the trends changing in the UK. So we're starting to see with this advent of disposable market, the disposables are now gone from about a 5% and declining share to about a 10% share of the overall market. If you take a look at the retail channels and where these products are being bought, you're now starting to see that even out between traditional retail, online, and the specialty vape stores. Now, as I said, vaping has rebounded from the valley and the lockdown downturn, and vaping is actually at an all-time high, with 7% of the UK population now vaping. The UK smoking rates have dropped below 13.8%, and this is the first time we've seen this since 2015, and it's down from its peak of 16.3% during the pandemic. And also importantly, the proportion of vapers that have never previously smoked remains extremely low in the UK at around about 1.2%. Although we do have a bit of concern around that with the youth vaping uptake from disposables. So that's something that we're keeping a very close eye on. And the percentage of ex-smokers who now vape has risen from 12.3% in 2020, and that's up from 11.7% in 2019. So these figures for me indicate that the powerful anti-vaping lobby's best attempts to smear e-cigarettes' effectiveness at helping people quit smoking, at least in the UK, is not working. But when we take a look at vaping amongst young people, and this is, I think, the Achilles heel that we've seen affect other markets, vaping and smoking prevalence amongst young people seems to be staying about the same, which is good. But we're fearful, I think, with the disposable market, that figure will start to uptake. Now, the UK VIA has called for a minimum of £10,000 per fine for selling illegal product in the UK, but also selling to minors, because we fear that without these large fines, retailers will be tempted to bypass the regulations that are in place. Now, the misperceptions of the relative harm of smoking and vaping should also be addressed, but this is difficult to do with the regulatory environment that we have in the UK. And obviously more research is needed on the apparent differences in the prevalence of smoking and vaping in different socioeconomic groups amongst young people and adults. And the UK VIA has actually commissioned the largest economic impact study of vaping ever undertaken in the UK. And the results of that should be out within the next 2 months. But the other issue we have in our industry, not only in the UK, but I think this is prevalent around the world, is the fact that the perception of the harm caused by vaping compared to smoking is increasing out of line with the evidence and rising. The latest statistics from the UK show that 29% of current smokers actually believe that smoking is less harmful than smoking. And 38% believe that vaping is as harmful as smoking. And these figures are just not correct. Now, the very interesting situation we have in the UK that many other markets don't have is that we actually have a very favorable use of vaping amongst our public health departments. And recently, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, has recently updated their guidance to include the introduction of nicotine-containing e-cigarettes to the list of possible interventions that are to be made available and accessible to smokers. Now, this is really a huge step forward and a vote of confidence for vaping in the UK. We heard in the international news about prescription vapes in the UK, and the UK government is really trying to make it more easy for vaping brands to bring their products into the regulated medical market. And that will really open up 2 tiers of distribution for our products in the UK. But again, we're not seeing this same trend happening around the world. But with that, comes problems. And the problems for us is really controlling illicit vaping products, brands that are trying to bypass the system, and companies that are really not using responsible and reliable compliance companies. So with that, we work very closely with the MHRA, who's the compliance body for vaping in the UK. And they're really starting to take a harder stance on these non-compliant products. They've got a new system in place that allows them to look very closely at every submission, and they weren't previously able to do that under the EU system. And further updates are underway to make it even easier for both consumers and retailers to identify products that are pre-approved by the MHRA. And those will be rolling out officially from the MHRA very shortly. But even if you take a look at what's happening overall in the market, we're still seeing about £3 million worth of overstrength, unregulated product, specifically in the disposable markets, being sold every week in the UK. Now, a word of caution, especially to the brands that are represented here today. Because we're seeing that continued alarm in the UK media, we really are taking a hard stance because our regulations are under review at the moment. We've just had our review of the Tobacco-Related Products Directive, which is basically being continued on as is with no changes. So we won't see the harsh effects like flavor bans, perhaps, that other areas have seen. But with that, the MHRA has really kind of knuckled down, and they're now testing all of the products on the market for two various different things. One is the actual fill of the devices to make sure they are compliant with a 2 milliliter maximum level, but also taking a look at the constituents of the e-liquids as well. Now, this is a new step over and above what the MHRA has normally done. So you may see some brands being withdrawn from the market because they don't reach the required standard. We're also working very closely with trading standards groups around the country. And I've actually been involved myself in many raids of stores. And we've been pulling out thousands of illegal disposable products for multiple different ranges. So either for too large nicotine strengths, or the devices just don't have the correct warnings and notifications on their packaging. So that's something that retailers need to be very careful of. And we've also been working very closely with the ECCC and Mr. Rao and his group that you heard from the start to really kind of look at closing down factories in China that are not producing the products to standard or are doing copycat products, because we're starting to see those enter our markets as well. And lastly, we come to Vaporil. Now, Vaporil is a vaping awareness campaign that we run globally. We have done for the last 5 years. And this year, even though we were still virtual, we had over 6 million people engaged with Vaporil worldwide. So if hopefully the UAE will join us on that mission next year. But that's my quick overview of what's happening in the EU. But what we're going to do now is we're going to bring in our virtual participants as well. And we'll enter into a discussion about what's happening globally. If the audience has any questions, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone over to you and you'll be able to ask the participants any questions you may have. Thank you. Alrighty. So welcome, Patricia, and welcome to Peter. Can you hear us okay?
Thank you, yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah, when have I not been able to hear you, John?
Thank you, Peter. Much appreciated. So we're going to open it up to the panel. And I want to kind of start off with looking at what are the biggest global challenges that we're facing in the worldwide market. I know, Patricia, you have some real big headaches in the US with the FDA and PMTAs. What do you think is the biggest challenges that you're facing over there? And will there actually be an industry in the US going forward?
Thank you, John. And I had actually prepared some slides, except that it changes from week to week, so they already become obsolete. The US, let me start by saying, first of all, thank you to all of you for enabling us to participate remotely, and thoroughly regret not being in Dubai. Personally, it's one of my favorite places, and all of you are our friends. The US remains the most appealing market for all type of nicotine products, and of course for vaping products in particular, because of its size, because of obviously the disposable income, but also because the opportunities are still there. Of course, we have all seen that the industry was perhaps a little bit immature, and when the deadline came for submission of pre-market tobacco applications in September 2020, most of them, because to be very frank, they were advised by consultants that either didn't know or didn't really care, took a really light touch approach and didn't take the requirements of the pre-market tobacco application pursuant to FDA's guidance seriously. So they submitted what I like to call placeholder submissions, about 6 million of them, clearly vastly inadequate. We really cannot blame the FDA only for it, right? Of which the vast majority, 5 million, or all of them except for 1,000, according to FDA statistics, have basically been rejected, which of course led to the disappearance of a large number of products from the market. Now, you will notice that already a few years ago, because of a variety of legislative actions by the FDA and by other regulators and by Congress, slowly but surely the retail of vaping products concentrated exclusively in the traditional brick and mortar stores, convenience chains, gas stations, and so on, which had been the traditional avenues for sale of cigarette products. And the fact that you can still see some vape shops and what frankly amounts to illegal online sales at the present in the US, it's just because of a lack of enforcement, not because necessarily those products would be legally on the market today.
Hang on. As an online vendor in the US, I object to that last comment.
No, don't get me wrong, not all of them. There are possibilities, but as you know, it's extremely difficult for the vast majority of the online retailers. And I stand corrected. You're absolutely right. It's not banned, it's just extremely difficult. But also, the reason it concentrated is because, frankly, that's where the consumers are. I mean, the vast majority of the buyers are, right now developed a pattern of purchasing vaping products where they used to purchase cigarettes, which is point of sale. It doesn't mean it's impossible to sell them online. It's just not a huge market. And frankly, it has never been a really huge market online in the US historically. But that being said, focusing back on regulations and what's happening, there are still a number of products under review by the FDA, but we have seen as late as last Friday afternoon the first disposable products being authorized under the PMTA pathway, which demonstrates repeatedly that it is a viable pathway. You just have to have the commitment, the resources, and more importantly, the know-how to understand exactly what you need to do. It's not enough to have the money, you also have to listen to your advisors. But the most important thing is also we need to understand that there are further, or there will be additional authorizations. Of course, the products that have been authorized today are all tobacco flavored, because in the US took a view that they were not going to ban an entire category, meaning flavor products, but rather the review is going to be product by product and SKU by SKU, following the PMTA, pre-market tobacco application pathway. Personally, I have doubts that FDA will authorize flavored vaping products, but I don't think it's impossible. I just think FDA is right now balancing and scrutinizing the quality of the studies that have been submitted in support of flavored vaping products, and some may emerge successful and receive a marketing order under the PMTA. We just don't know. So far, they haven't. Menthol products are still under review. And again, that's also because in parallel, there is an initiative, a proposed rule to ban menthol in cigarettes, though not in vaping products. And I believe that this is further, there is an argument there to say that in fact, FDA should consider authorizing, issuing marketing orders for menthol flavored products, because simply the consumers of menthol cigarettes at such time in the future if those products were to in fact disappear from the US market, which again, this is also debatable, and it's, you know, it's a long runway. We're not talking about tomorrow, we're talking 5 years down the road or what have you. But at the same token, if you want consumers to move away from menthol cigarettes, you have to obviously offer them something that replaces and substitutes these products. But I cannot emphasize enough that, you know, the cigarette market in the US wasn't that diversified. It was, you know, obviously there are 200 cigarette manufacturers in the US, but the reality is that the market had always been dominated, 99% of it or however much, by 4 players. So it is very likely that the same scenario will play out with vaping products. And again, that is not something to be surprised. Also, of course, it would be great and it's amazing to have great diversity of products. The reality is the consumer will make do with the products that will remain legally on the market. But that also, therein lies the opportunity for foreign manufacturers that are committed to entering the US market, conducting all the necessary studies and all the, committing the resources, the time. It's not a short process, it's a 2 years process to put together a robust pre-market tobacco application. For those who are committed and have the know-how and the understanding, the doors are wide open. And again, provided that FDA, which you have to give it to them in spite of the politics behind of the FDA. The Office of Science actually has demonstrated that they do take an earnest look at products that are before them and at the science before them, and occasionally authorize some. And occasionally they will authorize modified risk tobacco product claims if supported by the necessary studies. So again, it is the most important market in the world because of size alone, and it's not impossible. It just requires manufacturers to reset their mindset and to understand that the legislation is not going to change anytime soon in the US at federal level with respect to vaping products, that the FDA by now already has a view as to what kind of studies they want to see for a PMTA review, and that it is doable, again, with the time and effort. So all of this is actually quite encouraging for the committed manufacturers from outside. It's an invitation to say, look, this can happen. And again, not only for nicotine, but other product categories as well. With one caveat, the greater the variability of the product, the more unlikely it is that FDA will ever authorize it. So consistency is key, measurability, and also, of course, good and robust science. And I will leave it here because I'm sure you'll have a million questions, but also it's also Peter's time to discuss some other markets. I could enter into discussions about various other markets. Obviously, unfortunately, the trend is not very stellar in terms of bans continuing to pop up and so on, which is really, really very sad. But there you really need a very local and very active local and engaged trade association or a body of scientists that will engage with the government and educate the government proactively on the realities of this market, because otherwise it's easier to ban, and very few bans are in fact ever reversed. I'll stop here and I'll hand it over to Peter. Thank you again. Very happy to answer any questions now or after.
Thank you, Patricia. Peter, you're dying to get into this one, so we'll open the floor to you.
Yeah, I still haven't quite forgiven Patricia for that comment about a small number of illegal online sales. I think we may have to have a discussion about that.
There are some illegal as well. You'll agree, right? I mean, if you type in vaping products and they sell them from all over the world. So let's face it,
They do. This is correct, and it merely goes to show the futility of creating legislation that forbids vaping companies from using fairly basic public services like the U.S. Postal Service, and the madness that's brought upon us. Now, I don't want to dwell on that. Because I like Patricia and she's usually right. So I'll move to just a couple of brief points that might help the discussion in the room as this moves forward. Please take the usual thank yous to organizers, moderators, and everybody else as read. I think there are three things that I would observe from where I sit as CSO at vaping.com in my sort of slightly strange capacity as Chief Strategic Officer. I think firstly there is a very interesting juxtaposition happening right now, where we are seeing a reconsolidation of the nicotine market at lots of different levels. But at the same time, we're seeing a diversification in consumer preferences. We have seen a huge rise in Europe, for example, in the use of nicotine pouches that were previously considered a weird fringe sport outside of Scandinavia. I think that's to be welcomed. I think it's something that consumers are telling us that they want, and as consumers over 10 years of the expansion of the reduced risk category learn to understand their own relationship with nicotine and what it means to them, they're able to make better and better choices so long as those choices maintain well informed. I think secondly that we've seen relative quiet with respect to the torrent of bullshit that we've become used to over the last 5 years in relation to is vaping safe or not? A ridiculous question, and we certainly still do see some of it. That might lead some of us to believe that the storm has passed. I very much fear that it hasn't. I very much fear that it's just waiting. Dustin told you all about the risks in the EU. Patricia told you about the mess that remains in the US, and I'd like to hear Patricia's views on the Triton case in the Fifth Circuit in the next round of comments, and what the implications of that are for the open system market. But I think we need to remain on our guard. The fact that we're not getting a TPD revision as quickly as we want shows that people like Dustin and people like John are doing their jobs, and they're doing it well. That doesn't mean that the other side don't exist. That doesn't mean that they can be underestimated. And then the third thing that I would like to touch on very briefly is that we mustn't lose sight of the developing world and the developing markets when we consider harm reduction in the round. Lest we all forget that the country with the largest percentage of smokers in the entire world is Russia. And that's a very difficult place to do business in right now. Lest we forget that there is still an effective ban in place in Australia, which has been very progressive in its tobacco control in other ways. Lest we forget that there are still huge numbers of smokers in places like Indonesia. There are still bans all over South America, which are deeply unhelpful. These are areas which we sometimes lose in our debate, which tend to focus in the US and they tend to focus in Europe. And I very much think that over the next 5 years, what we're going to see is those debates becoming more and more important in general harm reduction discourse. I will stop there, but I would very much appreciate the views of the panel on what I just said. And when you come back to Patricia, please don't forget the Triton case. And remember, the online market,
several others as well, very happy to discuss.
30% of the US market, Patricia, and there are some of us that do it properly.
Thank you, Peter. Patricia, you talked a couple of minutes ago about the importance, I think, of associations like mine and Dustin's, but I think there's also a huge importance around the consumers and making sure that the consumers have their voice heard. And I think that's where you come in, Fred, and your organizations around the world. How can consumers start to engage? How can they make a change in these regulatory situations that are happening around the world?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, the audio works. That's good. It's definitely interesting to see that basically for the last 15 years we have a technology that more and more consumers and smokers get exposed to, or technologies actually I want to say, that help you to switch from combustible cigarettes, the traditional cigarette, to a less harmful way of consuming nicotine. Probably if industry stays responsible and at the same time regulators stay out of the way of innovation, nicotine consumption in 10 years would look probably very different than even the most top-notch least harmful nicotine consumption right now, right? Because we're still in this discovery stage, and we could see that from the previous speakers and slides. There are different consumer trends right now happening. There are the pouches, which are my go-to when I get on a plane, because I don't want to get banned lifetime on Emirates. That would be really bad for me being based in Dubai. Then disposables were just mentioned. I was surprised to see it's only 5 to 10% in the UK. I would have thought it's much more for my own consumption of disposables. And of course, you also have the heated and refillable and pot systems, but that shows that probably we're still at an innovation stage, a massive innovation stage. And it's probably a bit like the early and mid-90s where you had almost a dozen different video gaming consoles, right? And later on things consolidate and consumers figure really out what they want to do. But at the same time, we now see in really large countries and markets such as the US or the EU, massive mega regulation that will inhibit most of this innovation and even rewind the clock in many fields, right? By banning a lot of, most likely, and that's what we're trying to fight against, most likely banning a lot of innovations. As an ex-smoker who managed to fully switch probably 3 years ago, what really helped me were flavors, and most vapers I'm talking to who were smokers at some point, it was actually flavors and trying out different flavors and figuring out what works for them. So this is like where I currently see the biggest threat for us consumers being deprived of flavors, because I'm personally worried, and consumers I speak to all over the world, we are worried to actually end up having a cigarette between our fingers again and smell coming back home in the evening. And a lot of people, and that's about almost, it depends on the market, but between 50 and 70% of consumers are not interested in tobacco flavors. Also, depending on the market, menthol is not interesting. I think in the US, there's a bigger case of menthol because there are also much more menthol cigarette users. But this current massive push, and we can see it in Canada, we can see it in many parts in all of the US, we can see it in many parts of Europe. And that's something, especially in Brussels, we also try to educate policymakers how important these flavors is. No, it's not to drag kids to become vapors, it's actually to bring people from the cigarette to different nicotine consumption ways, such as vaping, and keep them there. And not people not lapsing, consumers not lapsing back to the cigarette. And this is something where, A, we want to inform more consumers, because obviously you have the die-hard vapors that know everything and know every regulation, they know the FCTC and whatever, but most vapors are actually fairly ignorant because it's only a tiny part of their life. Then what's even more astonishing to me is how ignorant smokers are. It was good to see the UK numbers on this, but this should be really the target group for education, because it's about helping people to stop smoking if they want to stop. And I think most smokers actually, I mean, there are of course some very proud smokers, but most people would love to switch, because the moment you realize it's not the burning cigarette that makes your morning with a coffee great, but it's actually the nicotine, you're happy to switch given all the side effects of smoking normal cigarettes. And yeah, I mean, but seeing all these regulatory battles popping up all over the world and the ignorance of policymakers, medical community, and existing smokers means there's a lot of work to be done. And maybe there's some criticism also, and first of all, maybe something positive. I see more and more initiatives from retailers and manufacturers to have more self-regulation, which is probably needed, unfortunately, because otherwise we just trigger the nanny state, the paternalistic regulators even more. I was recently in a country in Southeast Asia, I won't say where, but I walked into a vape shop, and the vape shop was called Toys for Boys. And I just imagined any Bloomberg-funded NGO standing in front of it, taking a picture, and that would probably immediately lead to some sort of ban, right? I mean, calling a vape shop Toys for Boys. I mean, it would be funny in a world where you don't have people who immediately say, think about the children, and therefore having some decency when it comes to marketing. So we actually it's still an uphill battle against regulators that just do not want to understand the humanitarian potential of tobacco harm reduction, and it's a massive humanitarian case. Unfortunately, many people, vested interest, does not want to understand it, but we also need to make sure not to trigger them too much. So we actually have time to at least educate those people who are in the middle ground, who are not fully committed yet to fully ban vaping or ban all flavors, which my opinion would be de facto ban of most of the positive effects of the industry, of the products.
No, and I think those are great points. I think that's something that Dustin and I struggle with. And I would put that out to manufacturers that, you know, you need to look at how you market the products. You need to use or understand the language that you're using, because it will have and does have a huge effect on how regulators view our industry. You know, we talked a lot about flavor bans and pressure being put on the industry. I want to kind of talk a little bit about the World Health Organization and perhaps why they're taking such a unreasonable and unrealistic viewpoint on vaping. You know, we're supposed to be looking at this from a tobacco harm reduction perspective, but the World Health Organization seems to be going down a purely, you know, prohibitionist lane. Why do we think that is? Patricia or Peter, what's your feeling on that? Why are we seeing so much negativity from the World Health Organization on vaping?
If I can answer very briefly, it's because they hear evidence created by scientists they trust, and they ignore the evidence from scientists they perceive are somewhat affiliated with the industry, and there is very few in between, really. So I think this is the primary reason. If you put yourself in their shoes, they're tending to listen to the ones who, you know, to the universities, the clinical researchers and so on, that provide, you know, science on a number of topics, whether it's vaccines and so on and so forth. And those same people, again, being generally funded by governments, though not always, or by some private entities, tend to have already made up their mind and build evidence in support of some niche sort of negative elements of, you know, the comparison between vaping and non-smoking, whereas they should be focusing on the comparison between vaping and smoking, which is the most deadly form of nicotine delivery. But again, there are by now thousands and thousands of studies that address this category, yet WHO chooses to listen to only a few of them, and those again present some negatives, and that's the reason, in my opinion. I don't think they've made up their mind just because they don't like the category or anything like that. There are some enlightened people there as well, as there are enlightened people among academia, and there are people that have changed their mind. You know, David Abrams, for instance, I know at the beginning they were skeptical, and then, you know, very prominent public health advocates have changed their mind with respect to not only electronic cigarettes, but also nicotine pouches and so on. But that's the reality. The other thing is also, you know, they don't talk, WHO doesn't talk to the industry much or at all really. And therefore, you know, obviously doesn't have access to a lot of information or ignores very, very meaningful scientific evidence. And again, we need to talk strictly about the science, because WHO and other regulators are supposed to be following the science. And another reason that I think is also very important, and I've actually written or co-authored an article on that, is they don't appreciate the cost-benefit analysis of migrating a large number of folks from point of view of the cost, healthcare cost, loss of life costs. That doesn't factor in the cost-benefit analysis of switching large batches of population from smoking to vaping products. Is lost on them, and it's very surprising, because we all have the snooze Swedish model and, you know, historical data of over 60 years of how, you know, the lowest cancer incidence and all of that, and this kind of data by now with 10-15 years of experience, you know, to some extent could be built for you know, extensive use of electronic cigarettes. However, again, there is that cost-benefit analysis is just not being conducted, and it's a shame, because, you know, governments do cost-benefit analysis all the time. Look at environment. I mean, environment is one big cost-benefit analysis exercise. They realize how much it costs us to damage the environment and how much it costs every one of us. Yet a similar or analogous analysis is not conducted with respect to what would happen, what's the hypothetical, what would happen if that many percentage of people would switch to less risky and less harmful forms of nicotine delivery, such as vaping products and, to some extent, nicotine pouches. Nobody seems to be having that argument or raising those issues in government.
Peter, what's your opinion?
Largely the same, but I'll put it more bluntly. They live in an echo chamber, and they don't want to listen to people outside their weird circle of trust. I mean, it's known as regulatory capture, and it leads to the culture war that we've seen in this sector almost since its inception, with the exception of the UK and New Zealand. I do often look at this, and I look at other forms of culture war and other forms of insistent disagreement and polarization in lots of political areas, and think, well, is this not just a microcosm of the moment the world is going through? People stand on one side or the other of a debate and shout at each other rather than actually trying to take a calm and considered look at the facts on the ground. It's unfortunate, it makes for a more dangerous world, but it does appear to be the world that we live in at the moment.
No, absolutely.
And I will add one thing, if I may, John. When I grew up, I knew that there was only one truth. There weren't versions of the truth or interpretations of the truth. It either was or it wasn't. And that seems to be lost on mankind today as a whole.
No, absolutely. And I think you made a great analogy about discussions around the environment. And we saw in the recent COP on the environment how all stakeholders were brought together to discuss the issue, where we find with electronic cigarettes and smoking alternatives, it is that closed room, backdoor meetings that the industry is excluded from, which baffles me. Fred, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, probably 3 points on the WHO. I have like a healthcare and public health background and used to work more on the innovation in pharmaceuticals, so do a bit in there, and had to also engage with the WHO more from the side of like healthcare industry. And already on that side, you see that the WHO has a problem with the private sector per se. So if you're manufacturing or inventing the first COVID vaccine, you're still evil in the eyes of the WHO. Like it's just like an anti-industry or anti-private sector innovation view. And then if you're dealing with nicotine, in their view smoking or cigarettes, because in their view it's all the same, it's even worse, because if you're the WHO and their close stakeholders, it was their aim to solve all non-communicable diseases in the world. And now you have innovative companies solving this much better than all the strategies WHO and other public health activists and advocates tried to succeed with over the last couple of decades, and they just don't have the intellectual honesty to admit this. I mean, you can see it in the UK, for instance, where there was this intellectual reckoning. Okay, someone else solved it much better than we did, and we should acknowledge this, because that actually helps people. So I think that's a major problem. And then also, I think what we, in terms of communication, really try to do, and many try to do, and I think it's very important, is talk about nicotine and not talk about smoking. And we need to normalize nicotine. This is a bit, if you look at harm reduction in other areas, so if you look at HIV harm reduction or needle exchanges, that you had usually like 1 to 2 decades of massive opposition of all vested interest, of the churches, of health systems, of the political system, and it really takes to explain to people, for instance, explaining conservatives in the 60s why birth control is maybe a good idea. And then later on, it was in the 80s about HIV, in the 90s and 2000s about needle exchanges in many countries, where you need to convince everyone about the net benefit. I think someone said that previously. And that's a long cognitive process for people who have just been, in a very binary fashion, have been fighting something, You were fighting drug use. You were fighting having fun with someone else without having a baby, without that intent. That these are like very, it requires very big psychological change in people, and then we're not just fighting the views of people, but entire institutions, right? Because you have an entire machinery, not just the WHO, but also an entire ecosystem of nonprofits that receive billions a year just for succeeding this mission. And if suddenly Bloomberg Philanthropies would say, oh, we rather invest in innovative nicotine companies because it seems to fight smoking more efficiently, that would, of course, a lot of people would lose their jobs. And people really try to just keep their job and keep their budgets. And I think it's an uphill battle, as I said, for us. But I mean, the science and the facts are with us, and the humanitarian cause.
And I think that's a really important point. And I think that's where the UK kind of stands out on its own from around the world, because we've got a public funded health system, so the government has the ability to monitor how much these things cost, and their goal is to save as much money. So if they have a healthier population, it saves the healthcare companies money. But I think also they take a very different stance on the viewpoint on nicotine. They fully embrace and understand that it's the tar, the nicotine from combustible tobacco that kills, not the consumption of nicotine. So for them, it's, every smoker that switched to whatever form of new nicotine products out there, whether it's gums, lozenges, patches, they don't care. They just want to see smokers moving away and doing something that's better for themselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why the industry flourishes so well in the UK, but also the fact that legislators, the government, are willing to speak to industry. We have discussions all the time, and they want to understand how our industry can help. And in fact, we've just seen a report came out last week that really highlights vaping as being one of the 4 pillars of success in the UK's smoke-free 2030 goals. And Sandra Javid, who is the health minister in the UK, is bringing out a white paper in the spring, and it's going to include what he calls a vaping revolution, whatever that means, because we haven't seen it yet. But all of these things are very positive. And I think, especially, here in the UAE, where the market is just developing, is they need to look at different markets and what's working well from a regulatory standpoint, what's working well from cooperating with the industry, and really come out with their own version of what success would look like. I think the other area that we kind of want to talk a little bit about, and I know we've seen this cropping up in many discussions, is the environment. Dustin, you kind of highlighted some of the things that are happening in Europe, but with the fact that we use a lot of lithium-ion batteries, a lot of plastics, how do we think that's going to affect the global industry? Are we going to see huge changes in innovation, or is huge changes in innovation necessary when it comes to how these products are developed? What's the panel's feeling on that?
I don't want to monopolize the time, but I just recently had this thought, because I just started experimenting with disposables, and I think from the consumer experience they're great, but I also see, there is a very, very good case to make for environmentalists to very quickly go after this, and Dustin mentioned this in his presentation. So while I love it as a consumer trend, because let's say before I go out for dinner and I know I might have 1 or 2 pints, I grab a disposable at the convenience store, I know it's fully charged and fully loaded, and I won't run out of battery or juice over the next 2 or 3 hours. I see the problem, especially with batteries being in there. So I know a couple of coffee companies have this deposit scheme, so you just collect your Nespresso pots, however, whatever coffee pots you have, and once a month they're being picked up. So I think probably a good combination of keeping online deliveries, orders and deliveries of these systems legal, and maybe once a month when they're delivered, your disposables you used in that previous month are being picked up and recycled, which probably also from a resource usage might even make sense. And I'm not from industry, right? But I'm just kind of trying to think, how can we save this innovation? Like some sort of voluntary deposit schemes, either at point of sale or just a monthly pickup that the delivery company, the parcel service that brings your next 30 disposables, picks up the last 30 and you get a small discount or something like this. Especially recycle the batteries and maybe the glass bottles in which they come. Is probably, I hope that pops up soon so we as advocates can use as an example for why it shouldn't get banned.
Dustin, what do you think?
I'll play devil's advocate here for a second to say that no waste is better than recyclable waste. But at the same time, I think the real problem of the disposables and of the industry, much like for that matter for car industries, is supply chain disruptions, the raw materials and the parts that are needed to be made. And I think there, in terms of the industry, that's where we have to think in terms of sustainability, because getting to a mindset where everything will be recycled, I think it's easy. We didn't used to recycle bottles 40 years ago, and now we recycle, thank God, everything. Again, mindful of the fact that I think the generations coming after us are going to take a view that no waste is better than recyclable waste. But I think the more immediate issue is really the supply chain, the resources availability, and also ultimately, will this drive innovation? And I will argue that it will, because there is nothing that puts fire under an R&D department than when you're told that you cannot buy your ingredient or your parts anymore, or when you're told that lithium mines are not really popping up as much as we thought, for environmental concern reasons, or some such other other resources are being not replenished. So I do think that this will trigger innovation, and this is all for the good of the consumer and of the industry. I think it's also a very important niche where investment funds, and I'm looking to you, GCC and Dubai, where of course a lot of the resources and the know-how in terms of investment funds and investments are. This is where you have to invest in the future, in research on sustainable products that are able to move large amounts of population from higher risk products to lower risk products, and that in itself is a business, just the science behind and the research behind product development in this category.
Yeah. I'll weigh in on disposables because it seems like the issue of the moment. I mean, they are a humongous political risk. It will. We're certainly seeing that there's obviously the youth risk. The barrier to entry in terms of cost is lower. And we're also seeing the environmental risk. A very good friend of mine in Malta, who's involved in marine conservation, recently posted, a several paragraph long rant on Facebook about, hell, we only used to have cigarette butts. Now you're throwing these things with batteries into the ocean, and they're getting washed up in wildlife reserves. It's a problem, right? Let's be very clear about that. How we have to focus on how we solve that problem. How we manage the risk. To what extent are we comfortable with this, and under what conditions are we comfortable with it? Are we comfortable with it on the basis that it includes recycled materials? Are we comfortable with it on the basis that we can recycle batteries? Or are we not? Because you can't predict consumer behavior, and even if only 1% of the disposables produced, or even if 0.1% of the disposables produced find their way into natural ecosystems, you've got a massive bloody problem. So I'm caught, as a business, it's difficult to ignore them. As somebody who thinks about public health, it's difficult to argue against the idea that giving somebody a lower barrier to jump when experimenting with a technology that might improve their lives is a good thing. But let us not be blind to the humongous and terrifying political risk that these things could potentially cause.
Absolutely, Peter. I couldn't agree more on that point. Dustin, you're dying to get into this one.
It's hard to add something after almost everything was said. I totally agree to Patricia. No waste is better than recycled waste. But we also have to keep in mind that it is better to vape than to smoke. Therefore, there are a lot of bad things when you look on the environmental side of the disposable cigarettes. But on the other hand, we see that we attract a lot of smokers who were so far not attracted to our products and get in touch with vaping products through the disposable cigarettes, and then it's our job to convert them to a refillable system. But I think we talked about the regulations, and what I can tell from Europe is that there is no chance that the products will stay the same. All products of our industry will stay the same like it is now. And that is not applying just for our products. Like I told you, like I showed you on my slides, it is valid for electric cars, for cell phones, for laptops. All these products will change in the future. And I think when I look at our devices, it's easy for us. At one point we have to change the disposable e-cigarette to a device where we can easily dispose the battery, separate to the liquid and to the plastic of the product. That is possible. And it would be smart from this industry to do this before rules are applying for that, to show that we are really aware of the duties we have. And yeah, and to add that, this will be done not just for Europe. There's not an e-cigarette existing for the European market, not an e-cigarette existing for the UK market. There's always one product. When a big market, from my point of view, for China, the most interesting market in the world right now, after we listened to Patricia, what happened in the US, is Europe the most interesting market for China. And when they get aware of the regulations we are facing, and they will adopt the product, and these products will be sold not just to Europe, they will be sold to everywhere in the world. And that is then a good development when it comes to more eco-friendly products. We have overall, to add that, 4 scenarios in the world that I see. I think the best regulation in the world has, of course, the UK with New Zealand. Maybe there are some other countries, but those are the best ones. Then comes, from my point of view, Europe. I think the TPD and also the new battery directive and the plastic waste regulation that we will see are overall good ideas, and the TPD is a good framework to work with. We have to be aware what will be updated in the next years, and there are bad scenarios like the US, but at the end we have also, we don't forget that Peter mentioned it, and we have a lot of bans in some countries where the product e-cigarette is overall banned. For example, India, with 1 billion people living there and a high smoking rate, they banned our product overall. So we have to be careful, we have to look into the future and avoid plastic waste, battery waste. We have to work on designs that allow eco-friendly dispose our products eco-friendly, and this all together is important for our future. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we're getting down to the last 5 or 10 minutes of the session today. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody out there that would have a question for our panelists? Nope. We got a quiet audience today. All right, well, I'm going to ask one kind of final question, and we'll do a round robin of all the panelists. If we were to look at the next 12 months, where do we see, or where do you see, the biggest challenge for the industry, a positive challenge? And what's the biggest negative thing you see that the industry will have to deal with? Patricia and Peter, we'll start off with Patricia first, and we'll go to you, Peter.
Thank you, appreciate it. So I do believe, as you know, one of our panelists mentioned, that China remains an opportunity. It is a challenge, but it is an opportunity. I think that market is vital because the largest number, you know, of smokers in the world, in fact, are in large populous countries such as China, India, Indonesia, and so on, and also generally in low and middle income countries, which China is not one of them. But those are the countries that where we absolutely have to move smokers away from smoking, and that's an opportunity. But it requires wise, deliberate engagement, and also a strong, you know, whether it's a trade association or an interest group, it could be an industry group that actually has the ability to move the needle in that direction. And that's not necessarily a positive opportunity, but it is an opportunity and a challenge. The second opportunity I still continue to see in the United States, where we will see inevitably, watch Friday afternoons, the news coming out of the FDA. They tend to send them at the end of the working day on Fridays. We will continue to see pre-market authorizations, marketing orders issued in favor of various products. So the flavor debate will be very interesting. I know I still owe Peter an explanation on the Fifth Circuit case, but we'll take it offline. The long and the short of that, it's a temporary spike, but I don't think it changes on the overall, the fact that FDA still retains authority. So yeah, China and the countries that have banned vaping products, absolutely, you know, the forces of public health of the world have to rally to reverse those bans, because the cost in lives lost is huge. The larger the countries, again, India, China, 2 examples, the more you know, I mean, when you calculate the numbers, it's scary how many lives could be saved and how many are not saved because of that. So it's incumbent upon all of us to work in that direction.
Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, look, John, you and I have been around a while, right? It's like Groundhog Day. This shit never changes. The opportunity remains saving many, many lives through giving smokers better stuff. That's what it's always been. That's what it's always going to be. The challenge is the dual threat of the more idealistic elements of the opposition to vaping continuing to pump out bullshit, and the less reputable parts of our industry continuing to do dumb things. That's how it always has been, that's how it's always going to be.
Thanks, Peter. Fred, what do you think?
I would just second Peter.
And Dustin.
Let me not answer directly to the question, but mention something else what is, from my point of view, important for the whole world. Also, when it is a European regulation, I think the revision on the TPD2 is one of the most important points, most important challenges in the futures, because a lot of countries in the world are adopting the TPD. So far, it's a good regulation. We talked about flavor bans and all the stuff. In conclusion, we have the biggest challenges ahead which our industry ever had in the next years, but that is also valid for the last 10 years, and our industry is stronger than it ever was. So I'm overall extremely optimistic, but the challenges I see in the next years, from my point of view in Europe, that have a spillover effect maybe on the whole world, is the TPD2, the revision on that, and everything around that, yeah.
Absolutely, and I think from my perspective, the two areas that I focus the most on is changing that misperception about the relative harms of vaping and other new nicotine products, but also the challenge of how do we do that and keep them out of the hands of young people who don't smoke. I think for me, those are the two biggest challenges. Well, with that, I'd like to thank all of my panelists, those who are here in person in Dubai, but also those virtually joining us today, Patricia and Peter. Thank you very, very much. Sadly, we couldn't have you here in person today, but maybe next year we'll change that. But thank you to all my panelists, and thank you for the audience for listening to us today. That concludes the first panel for the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That went well.